Welcome and thank you for joining us for our Zoom panel titled Long and Indeterminate Sentences. Everyone at Safe and Just Michigan are thrilled you are participating. We've muted your microphones to ensure that everyone can hear the panel, but please ask any questions you have using the chat function on Zoom. Thanks to all our co-sponsors and to our national co-sponsor, Dream Corps Justice. I'd now like to turn things over to our moderator for today's discussion, Daniel Jones, who is project coordinator for the Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration. Danny?
Thanks, Josh. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our panel discussion on long and indeterminate sentences. I am Daniel Jones, and I will be your moderator. As someone who is formerly incarcerated, I served 23 years of a juvenile life without parole sentence in the state of Michigan from the age of 16 to 39. I was released in March of 2019. I'm honored to have this opportunity to lead a conversation around an issue that not only has directly impacted me, but also continues to affect thousands of people who are currently incarcerated within the state of Michigan, their families, and millions of others similarly situated across the country. With that honor also comes a sense of responsibility to use myself as an example of how there are people who have committed great harms in community, have served long sentences of 20, 30, and even 40 plus years, who pose no threat to the public safety and could be released back into society. I'm lucky to have with me today a distinguished panel of guests who will engage in this discussion and speak more to this point. Joining me today is Dr. Mahar, who is a criminologist working as part of the policy team at Safe and Just Michigan, and for the last year has been working with Barbara Levine on a paper on long sentences. Also joining us is Ryan King, who is the Director of Research and Policy at the Justice Policy Institute. He has been widely published and has appeared on local and national radio programs discussing sentencing. Last but most certainly not least, joining us is Senator Jeff Irwin, who represents the people of Washtenaw County and serves on the Senate Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety, who also last session introduced legislation to reform Michigan's truth in sentencing law. Thank you all for joining us today. And let's jump right into this discussion. Starting with you, Ann, based on your research and analysis, what can be said in regards to Michigan and their sentencing practices?
Thanks, Danny. Excited to be on the panel and share some of this information. As you mentioned, for the last year, I've been working with Barb Levine, who was the founder of the predecessor to Safe and Just Michigan that was known as CAPS. So her and I have been working closely, looking not just specifically at long sentences, but doing an evaluation of the Michigan sentencing guidelines, which were enacted in 1998. And I won't get too much into it because there's going to be a great report that everyone should read soon. But what we're focusing on are the most serious cases. So we're looking at sentences for people who are being charged with second-degree murder, assault with intent to murder, first-degree CSCs, and armed robbery, all of which in Michigan are life max offenses. So just short of first degree, which in Michigan is a kind of automatic life without parole sentence, everything right just kind of under that threshold. And from our data, we are able to see, because we have some unique data that goes through all three sentencing guideline periods in the state of Michigan, exactly how much longer sentences have gotten. And sentence length has significantly increased. And that is just the sentence that is given at the beginning. When we bring in the issue of time served, sentences are even longer in Michigan because of, as Senator Irwin's going to talk about, truth in sentencing laws in Michigan. So at the same time that we put out and enacted our legislative guidelines, we also enacted truth in sentencing. So Michigan's pretty unique in that we require those who are incarcerated to serve 100% of their minimum sentence before they are considered eligible for parole. Even the federal system has a mechanism to reduce that amount of time served. So in the federal system, after 85%, you are eligible for release. Michigan, you have to serve every single day of your minimum sentence before you can be eligible for such consideration.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up question. And you said that sentences have gotten longer in Michigan. How much longer have these sentences gotten? And could you also speak to how many people there are in the state of Michigan serving life or long indeterminate sentences?
So from data that I looked at from the 2018 prison population in Michigan, and we're working on the new 2021 data, there are over 10,000 people in Michigan prisons who have minimum sentences of at least 20 years. So they have to serve those 20 years before they can be eligible for parole. And out of that 10,000 people, more than 5,000 or half are serving life sentences. So we are talking about a very large portion of the Michigan prison population. And that kind of gets into a lot of issues of when we talk about our prison population, because while the prison population in Michigan has decreased, there is a very large portion of our population who is going to continue to stay there because of the very long sentences that they are serving. So when we look at our old judicial guidelines and the ones that were put into action in the late 90s, we see prison sentences, the minimum sentences increasing 50%, 75%. So generally we have seen, at least increases of 8 to 10 years. And those are for those 4 kind of most serious life max offenses.
Does the data also show like the racial disparities? Do these long sentences, do they impact people of color, or could you please expound on that, please?
Of course. The disparity in prisons is pretty well documented across the country, and unfortunately, Michigan's no different. So Michigan's prison population is 53% people of color. Our state population is only 14% people of color. And then when we look at those who are serving life and long sentences, it is, don't quote me on the exact number, but I want to say 60 to 65% are people of color. So those who are of color are very overrepresented in our life and long sentences compared to the population in prison and the population in our state.
Thank you. And one last question before we move to our next panel. In comparison to other states, where does Michigan fit in national trends regarding length of sentence?
So regarding length of sentence, there's kind of 2 things here. So there's the minimum sentence length, but then there's also time served. And time served is affected by parole practices, parole and probation revocations, and truth in sentencing, as what I'm sure we'll talk about more later. But regarding time served, the most recent report was done by Pew in 2012, and we were number 1, unfortunately, with the time served average of 4 years, 4.3 years. And the next closest person or next closest state was Pennsylvania, and they were 6 months less than us. So we really are up there when talking about how much time people are serving in Michigan. And that is right on top of our long sentences for these very serious offenses. Additionally, a report that was released just 2 weeks ago by the Sentencing Project was looking at life sentences and virtual life sentences. And Michigan is one of the top 5 states for the number of people we have serving life without parole. So unfortunately, we are a bit of a standout, but not in a good way with our prison and sentencing practices.
And thank you, Ann, for sharing that. And congratulations on the work that you're doing. And I want to go to Ryan. So one of the problems we face is that when we address the issue of ending mass incarceration, ending long sentences, the conversation focuses on minor or non-violent crimes. So the question that I pose to you is, what do you see are the problems with this approach?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me on. This is a really terrific event, and I'm really delighted to have an opportunity to speak. And I think it's Michigan, as Dr. Mahar said, sort of is at the kind of vanguard of bad statistics to some degree, but trying to be a glass half full person also, I think, is tackling some of these issues before some of the other states. As a person who's stepping back who works nationally, I often talk about Michigan and Oregon and a couple other states that have their prison populations are comprised of people serving very long prison terms, and particularly crimes of violence. And so this was a conversation a decade ago where we would say, like, look, I know we're focusing on the low-level nonviolent offenses, and I understand that they're politically expedient, but take a look at some of these states like Michigan and Oregon, where you'll see this is sort of where we need to go next. And so I think it's been a process, but these conversations are part of growing momentum and attention to this issue. And so I feel really privileged to have an opportunity to speak here. And so I wanted to just kick off with a little bit in regard to your question, Daniel, with a little bit of a math lesson, basically about how the prison population is comprised. And we talk about it sort of stock and flow, how many people come in and how long they stay. So if you had 100 people who came in every year and they all stayed a year and you had the numbers never budge, you would basically have a stable prison population. But the reality is, as people come in and stay longer and all different rates, as more come in a given year and fewer go out, you obviously get the growth in the prison population. The issue is sort of how we measure time served. Dr. Mahar mentioned the Pew numbers. I actually worked on that project when I worked at Pew 8 years or so ago. Time served is a deeply problematic measure because typically the way we measure time served is an average of everybody who comes out in a given year. And so, as Dr. Mahar said, Michigan's numbers, which are the worst in the country, were 4 or so years, which if you ask a lot of people, they may not frankly think that's terribly long. And if you look across trends going in the 90s and into the early 2000s, when we were having really significant annual growth in the prison population, time served actually stayed pretty stable. Even in some states like Florida that put in place really tough truth in sentencing laws, we saw even post that the time served numbers didn't go up. And so that led a lot of people to draw the conclusion that time served is not what's driving our prison population. It's these people coming in the door and the flow of people coming in the door. And that was sort of a politically expedient data point as well, right? Because it allowed us to really focus on the less serious, predominantly nonviolent, non-person crimes. I think the issue is that mathematics has somewhat masked, and I'm not discounting, there are a lot of people who come in for low-level, non-serious offenses who cycle through or coming into technical violations. But if you're only looking at this time served measure of an average of the exit cohort, everybody comes out in a given year, you're missing everybody else who doesn't come out of prison. Right. So if all of those individuals, if you're in for 25 years and you don't walk out the door, your 25 years you served are never counted in that measure. And so what we have is essentially this sort of downward bias on the time served, and it creates a message that A, people don't serve very long in prison, and B, the time they're serving is pretty stable. And that has been sort of a narrative for a while, and one that I think informs an incorrect policy conversations. So one of the things that we had an opportunity to do when I was at the Urban Institute was, instead of measuring the average of people coming out the door, what we wanted to do is let's look at a snapshot the same way we typically look at a prison population. So how many people are in prison on December 31st, 2020? And that's how that will typically be the way you would measure it. So what we wanted to say is, all right, let's look at everybody who's in the prison population on December 31st at the end of a given year and see how long that they've served. And so then we're getting the short termers, but we're also getting the people that are serving 10, 20, 30, 40, and upwards years. And when we calculated that number, it was a dramatically different story. We began to see that, for example, people serving murder sentences for murder, you may see an average of 11 years, and that draws a lot of people who sort of say, oh my goodness, people are going in for 11 years for murder, that's crazy. So those are the people who are getting out. There's a whole bunch of other people that are what we call stacking up. And as the reforms of the last decade have focused increasingly on less serious, nonviolent offenses, the prison population has, by virtue, become a little bit more serious in terms of the crimes and a longer serving prison population. And so the reality, I think, is we're facing now is a lot of states, we've had a really terrific sort of 180-degree turn in the last 10, 12 years after 4 decades of sustained prison growth. We've seen really beginning in 2009, 2010, across the country, decline, some quite substantial, in the prison population for a host of different reasons. And that's really been really terrific. But a lot of that decline has been concentrated on individuals serving shorter sentences for less serious nonviolent crimes. Some of that is for political reasons. I want to just put out there as one example why we need to care. So first of all, in places like Michigan and Oregon, as I mentioned, when you have an increasingly majority of the population serving very long prison terms, obviously, if you're not addressing that population, you're not going to be able to really have a sustainable and meaningful reduction in the prison population. We also looked at some data from Alabama that had actually had taken some steps to both create some front-end diversion and reduce some admissions for less serious crimes. And we looked at the trends in the population for individuals sort of serving shorter, medium, and long prison terms. And so we saw this bend in the shorter terms, which you would expect based on policy and practice changes, which is terrific. But we saw the continued increase in the long prison terms, the population that was sort of untouched by changes in policy and practice. And if anything, in some cases, thrown under the bus in pursuit of the less serious policy changes. And at the end of the day, the stacking up effect, the growth, actually offset the benefits of the reforms. And so that's sort of why we're really raising this alarm about the need to tackle this population, putting aside issues of fairness and equity and public safety. Also, the reality is if you care about decarcerating, you absolutely have to, by virtue of the laws of mathematics, tackle people in for long prison terms. We've been ignoring them for decades, but it is a requirement, because all of the other really good hard work that folks are doing to decarcerate, if we're going to ignore 50, 60, 70% of the prison population, we're not going to get the results that we're looking for.
Thank you. A follow-up question I have is, in your report entitled Long Prison Terms, it speaks of there being a need for a public health informed and community-driven violence prevention strategy in order to end mass incarceration. Would you speak more about that and what it actually looks like in communities?
Sure, absolutely. Well, one of the things, and this ties in, I think, to conversations that this country has been having around sort of policing and law enforcement over the last year in really deep and meaningful ways. And so one of the things I'll use as an example, I had an opportunity to go to an event that was hosted by Daryl Atkinson from Forward Justice in North Carolina. Folks may be familiar with him. And he opened the event up by asking a question for everybody to basically think of an example of when you felt safe. And so they went around the room, and I would say probably half or more of the people were something along the lines of, running home to my mother or things like that. But nobody in the room said, I felt most safe when the police came and kicked in my door at 3 o'clock in the morning or dragged this person out. Most people don't define public safety through law enforcement. They define it through ways in which they feel safe in their community. They feel safe to allow their children to go out and play in the front yard or walk to school. And what we've done as a country is essentially funnel anything around safety through a law enforcement lens. And I think the reality we've seen, first of all, why that doesn't work. And that is sort of this ongoing conversation about the roles for law enforcement in the public, in schools. But also, I think, to me, that question of sort of when do you feel safe, that's a conversation that we need to be posing to all communities. So I think the reality is a lot of communities, particularly wealthy communities and communities that are predominantly white, have an opportunity to define how they feel safe and what they're going to use in pursuit of safety. And that's often the same thing. Education, healthy communities, opportunities for children to go out and recreational activities and economic opportunities for folks and safe, healthy communities, clean air, clean drinking water, all of this stuff that fits together. Is critically important that's how people define safe neighborhoods. And those conversations and questions, I think, frankly, have not been posed to communities of color. Instead, safety has been imposed upon them as more prosecutors, more arrests, more sentences to prison, and more sort of what would be defined sort of as addition by subtraction, right? We're adding safety by subtracting people from the community. And we've got decades of research now that's shown that that's frankly not the case. And really compelling research that has also shown that the more destabilized communities are, the more people who are cycling in and out of communities through the criminal justice system, the actual higher rates of crime, because there is as I use the word destabilization, it's very difficult for communities that are constantly destabilized to create those sort of confines and structures of safety and what they want to see. So the kind of stuff where like a neighbor may call somebody up and say, I see your kid doing this, you may want to come and get them, in another community that's call the police. Right. And so a lot of that's what we're really talking about is simply talking to communities and asking them what they're looking for. And I think you will find it's not more cops. It's going to be typically a lot more about investing in those core root causes of what we know about crime. It's healthcare, it's economic opportunity, it's education, it's housing, early childhood development, all the stuff that we know. These are the kinds of things that people want. So we're talking about, we've got billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars that are spent every single year across this country on the criminal justice system. And taking that money and reinvesting that into communities, not in more law enforcement, but in what those individuals in those communities are asking for, giving them agency. And I think you've seen in the protests around defunding police that what a lot of people are saying is more law enforcement, more arrests are not what we're looking for. We're looking for alternatives. And so I think a real push now, and we've seen in some communities, is try to, as much as one can, peel away some of those resources for the justice system, invest in some of these other things that address underlying causes of crime. Because we need to be, particularly when we're talking about violent crime, investing in policies and practice that prevent, right? Criminal justice system is reactive. At that point, the harm has already occurred. The obligations, I think, for all of us to come together as a community is to invest in things that prevent that from happening in the first place.
Thank you for that. And one more thing, I would love for you to speak on. Dr. Mahar definitely gave us some car hold stats that 53% of the prison population is people of color, but only make up 14% of the general population. Could you speak to the racial disparities across the country on how life and long sentences impact those communities of color?
Sure. I mean, those numbers are very similar to what we've seen in other states. So one report that I worked on, we mentioned Pennsylvania, which is 11% of the state population is Black, 49% of the prison population is Black, and 62% of the prison population serving long prison terms is Black. So as we've noticed, sort of as the prison population, as the sentences get longer, the population becomes Blacker. That's essentially the kind of rule of thumb that we've seen. One of the encouraging things in the last decade or so, we actually have seen overall incarceration rates for people of color in prison, both Black and Latino, declining for Blacks not insignificantly during the last 10 years or so, probably largely as a function of a lot fewer people going to prison for drug offenses. That's a terrific progress and something that I think after, as I mentioned, 40 years of us going in the wrong direction is something we really want to celebrate. But also, we don't want to lose the fact that if we are ignoring this long prison population, we are actually going to see rising rates of racial disparity in the prison population. So one of the things that may be surprising to folks is that the proverbial rising tide does not lift all boats. So just because people of color were disproportionately harmed by the criminal justice system doesn't mean that they disproportionately benefit from the reforms of the criminal justice system. That's something that has to be very intentional about how we design policies. And we've seen that in the juvenile justice system, and we've seen that in the adult criminal justice system, that actually where declining populations often exacerbate existing racial disparities, which were already pretty terrible to begin with. And that's largely a function of the fact that the longer, serious, long prison terms and life prison terms are disproportionately people of color. There's a couple of numbers to really just to leave you with. I mentioned Pennsylvania. I also wanted to point out that we do a lot of work at Justice Policy Institute around emerging adults. So individuals who go into prison between 18 and 25 years old. And of the people serving long prison terms, 10 years or more, 4 in 10 of those individuals went in and under the age of 25. And 60% of those individuals who went in, so of those emerging adults, were Black. The one piece I'll leave you with is 1 in 5 people who have been in prison across the country for at least 10 years is a Black man who went into prison at the age of 25. That is a national tragedy. And so I think it's critically important for us. We've seen some progress around individuals who've gone in as juveniles, And we're seeing some progress now, finally understanding that 18 is not some magic number. And Washington, D.C. recently passed a second look provision that will now allow individuals up to 25 who've committed their crimes up to 25 to be able to go before a judge for sentencing review after serving 15 years. So we are seeing some progress, and that's really terrific. But the reality is, as I mentioned, if we don't take these issues head on, these long prison terms head on, these racial disparities that we've already I think there's a consensus have been pretty horrific for the past 40 years, are only going to get worse.
Thank you for sharing that. And moving along in our conversation, going to you, Senator Irwin, as both Dr. Mahar and Mr. King have both stated, like, truth in sentencing is definitely a problem here in the state of Michigan. And last year, you introduced a set of bills that address truth in sentencing. Would you please share with us what people should know about these bills, and also what the current political landscape is surrounding the repeal of truth in sentencing in Michigan?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, and thank you to the other panelists, Dr. Mahar and Mr. King, I think, who did a great job of setting the table for this discussion. And thank you to Safe and Just Michigan for all the work you're doing in Lansing to help support criminal justice reform. We've had some productivity in the last couple of years, and I think that is in large part due to some great groups out there like Safe and Just Michigan and many others, including all the folks who I also want to thank who are watching this. We've had a real moment in Lansing that has been bipartisan and positive around criminal justice reform, and the only reason that's happened is because there is pressure and eagerness among the public to right some of these wrongs and to address some of these longstanding problems that we have in our state. And as the previous panelists mentioned, yes, Michigan has some of the longest prison stays in the entire country. And we stand out in this way that many of us are frankly embarrassed that we stand out. And we've seen this in our prison systems for many years. We've seen how it drives the disproportionate population, and we've seen how it drives mass incarceration. And so as a result, there's a number of us in Lansing who've been trying to correct some of these problems in specific ways. And one of the things that I think we need to do is I think that we need to fully repeal the truth in sentencing law that was passed at the height of the law and order, get tough on crime 90s. We just need to repeal that. It was a mistake. I think for a lot of people intuitively, that throwing the book at folks when they do something wrong is the right approach, but that intuition is wrong. And not only do we know that, those of us who have been working on these issues, but the data shows that. So it's time to stop the failed experiment of locking people up longer, throwing in the book at them, and throwing away the key. So what I've done is I've introduced a package of bills to repeal truth in sentencing and to reestablish the authority that the Department of Corrections previously had to offer good time credits or disciplinary credits to inmates who are participating in programs, not getting in trouble in prison, and overall showing with the way that they're doing their time that there's a greater chance of them being successful on the outside. And the goal of this in general is to get away from just trying to punish the people we're mad at, but to actually use the system in the way it's intended for rehabilitation, and to really only hold on to the people that we're genuinely afraid are going to hurt and victimize more people when they get out. So that's sort of some of the broad outlines of why I introduced that 3-bill package last year to reestablish good time and to end this failed experiment of getting tough on crime that started in the 90s. And the path going forward for these bills is that we're, kind of dusting these bills off. They were not taken up in Lansing last year, and so we're just trying to dust them off, make sure that the words that we're putting in there are the right ones. We're working with stakeholders, some of whom are a part of this call, to make sure that that proposal is the best that it can be, and getting ready to reintroduce that very shortly here. So I want to make sure that that gets reintroduced relatively early in the cycle, sometime this spring, so that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will have an opportunity to pick that bill up off the table and give it the consideration that it deserves.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership on this front. And a follow-up question to you is, as a former juvenile lifer myself, I am aware that there are still people inside who have not yet been resentenced. Would you please share with us where we are with the remaining juvenile lifers, and are there any legislative efforts to abolish life without parole sentences for people 18 years of age and under in the state of Michigan?
Absolutely, and there are some of those efforts underway. The situation here in Michigan is that when the U.S. Supreme Court in Miller v. Alabama stated that sentencing juveniles to life with no chance of parole is unconstitutional. It's cruel and unusual punishment. It's not the right thing to do, and it's illegal in America. It's unconstitutional according to the U.S. Supreme Court. And even though that decision was laid down many years ago, we still have a number of people here in Michigan who have not been resentenced. And so the latest numbers I saw showed that we had about 200 juveniles who are still in prison, who are still serving life without the opportunity of parole, and where their case has not been reheard and they haven't been resentenced fully. And I think that's an incredible embarrassment to our state. It's been years since this decision came down. And the reason why I think we still have so many juvenile lifers who've been unable to see a judge and unable to be resentenced is because we have prosecutors in our state who've taken it upon themselves to, in many cases, in fact, most until recently, requesting that these folks still get a sentence that is incredibly long and gives them no chance to get out. And so, for many of the last years, there's been fights in courtrooms across the state of Michigan between some of these law and order prosecutors and the attorneys of these individuals who are trying to get resentenced. And that's been the holdup. I think that there is, in addition to hoping that those cases move through the courts more quickly, there's been a couple other things that have happened that I'd like to update you and the listeners on. One is that we have elected some different prosecutors in some of these communities. There's certainly a new prosecutor in my community. Prosecutor Savitt was elected, and there seems to be a different approach in many communities to these resentencings, particularly when you've got new folks who've been elected. The other thing that's happening is that there are a number of us in the legislature who are looking at this issue and who are thinking, and I'll just speak for myself, I think that the legislature has a role to play here. Certainly when I was in the House and that Miller v. Alabama decision came down, I thought that there was going to be action on these cases much more precipitously. I'm shocked and frustrated that these cases haven't made their way through the courts in these many years. And so I'm working on legislation now that would require that that these cases come back up, and would require that the state no longer allows any juvenile in the future to face this kind of cruel and unusual punishment, and that we take it off of our law books, and that we give our prosecutors and our judges different tools to address these cases. Every single juvenile, in my view, no matter how serious their crime, should have an opportunity to get in front of a judge and seek parole, and to get in front of the parole board and seek parole. And so that's what I'm set to propose, is that the punishment that could come down in these cases, no matter what the circumstances, should still give these juveniles an opportunity to be paroled at some point later in their life. I think you're muted, Danny.
I was. Thank you. And thank you for sharing that, Senator Irwin. And one more follow-up question with you. You stated that there are constituents in the legislature who are with you on reforms around sentencing. And my question to you is, as a legislator, what convinced you that change was important in these areas? Now, I believe you're muted, Senator Irwin.
That's a great question. Part of it is that I like to read the reports. I like to read the kind of data that the doctor is talking about publishing. this is my job, and I take it seriously to actually understand what's happening in the criminal justice system. And even though, I'll never understand it as well as people who have made it their career and their life's work to work in the criminal justice system, I think I have an obligation to read those reports and understand what's happening and to try to transcend, whatever intuitive sense that I bring to the table. I also had the opportunity to serve in local government for a decade before coming to Lansing. That meant that, when I got elected to the County Board of Commissioners in Washtenaw County, one of the first things I did was to go tour the jail. And one of the first questions I asked was that, holy cow, how in a county like Washtenaw, where only 13% of the population is Black, how is it that 60% of the men in here are Black? What gives? And so when you start asking those questions for years, what you start to find out is that there are answers that people like me who are elected to represent the community need to be providing. And one of those answers is to get rid of truth in sentencing and restore good time. Another one is to improve our juvenile life without parole law and to give juveniles who are sentenced an opportunity for parole. Another one is to continue the work that we're doing with the governor's office on commutations and pardons. There's a whole lot of folks who are spending long and indeterminate sentences in Michigan correctional facilities that could be let out, who've been there for a long time and are older now and have a high likelihood of success. And so we're working on all those things. And I think that the motivation to work on all those things just comes from taking the role seriously. Actually visiting some of these facilities. I haven't been to every Michigan prison, but I've been to more than a couple, and talking with people who are inside and asking them what their experience is and asking them, what troubles they're having, and then just trying to get to work on those. And the final thing I'll say about this is that in all of my time looking at the criminal justice system, and all of my time reading these reports and reading books on this subject, the thing that is the smartest single thing I've read is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And the answer I keep coming back to is that we need to end mass incarceration. And the biggest single thing we need to do is to end the war on drugs. That is a huge element of our problem. So while we're continuing to work in my office on restoring good time credits and ending truth in sentencing and fixing our juvenile life law, we're also focused on that big goal, that big audacious goal, which is the goal I think that we all need to be focused on to end mass incarceration, which is to end this war on our people and to end the war on drugs.
Absolutely. And now I want to pose a question that, of course, to all of our panelists. All of the panelists, feel free to chime in if you like. But the question that I want to ask is, what are some real procedural problems that we may face in regards to changing truth in sentencing moving forward?
Well, the biggest issue is that this was passed, by a Republican majority and signed by a Republican governor, and we still have a Republican majority in the legislature. Michigan's state Senate has been controlled by Republicans since Ronald Reagan was president. It's been in Republican control for 35 years plus. And so that's the big struggle here, is that we've got some conservative, tough on crime folks that are still in Lansing and who are pushing back against these kinds of reforms. But what we're seeing in the communities is a bubbling up of interest from citizens that I think is changing some of the minds of some of the conservatives who are, the more they look at this system, the more they look at the money wasted, the more they look at the lives wasted, the more they look at how the war on drugs is the biggest failed government program of them all, the more of them that we're bringing on board.
Yes. Dr. Mahar, Mr. King, would either of you like to chime in?
Yeah, I would. So I've been kind of paying attention to the chat too, and I think something that someone said that I think really highlights part of this issue is that language matters. And when we talk about truth in sentencing, inherently, a lot of people agree without necessarily fully understanding what truth in sentencing is, and then how that is implemented. So kind of touching on a couple of things from the chat, Michigan, from what I've done some research on, is one of 6 states that doesn't really have a reduction in their time served for behavior programming and so on and so forth. Most states do, and like I mentioned earlier, the federal system does. So I think there is a need for education around what truth in sentencing is. Sometimes people say that, we're being soft on crime, soft on criminals, and there's this idea that this is new, that we want to start something new, but the first good time credit statute in Michigan was implemented in 1857, 20 years after Michigan became a state. And good time or disciplinary credits, as they were turned into in the 80s, has been part of the Michigan correctional practices almost as long as we've been a state, until 1998, when we implemented truth in sentencing. So we have a very long history of doing this, and it is not some new idea. And I think we really need to make progress on this, have people understand how this has impacted our prison population, those who are incarcerated, their loved ones, and get that better understanding to really be able to make progress in reforming these issues.
Thank you.
I would just add too, I think we need to be able to present an alternative vision to win folks over. And so I feel like I often look back to the war on drugs as somewhat of a blueprint. I mean, I know we're not where we need to be, but I mean, if you think about going back to, let's say, 30 years ago, when at that time President George H.W. Bush was holding a Ziploc bag with crack that turned out to not have been bought across the street from the White House, but at least at the time was a narrative, to where we are now. That's a lot of ground in 3 decades. I know 3 decades is a long time, but it's a lot of ground that was covered. And a lot of that was by telling the stories of individuals who've been impacted. But also I think we, at a parallel track, we were developing a lot of alternatives. So going from sort of the first drug courts in Miami to, 30 years later, where we know a whole heck of a lot more about, carrots working better than sticks in terms of substance use disorders. And so, I think I think we need to follow a similar path. And I think so when if we get folks to the point they say, all right, these really long prison terms are too much. We need to make some changes. What do you want me to do? We need to be able to say X, Y, and Z, as opposed to just telling folks. And I think that we'll have more success if we can pose that alternative vision, to whether it's to public or elected officials.
Thank you. Thank you all for responding to that. Another question that I would like to pose, and of course, again, all 3 of you can respond. When we do have conversations around, of course, ending life, long sentences, ending mass incarceration, the conversation often goes towards the men that are serving these sentences. But what has data and studies shown in regards to how women are impacted by these sentences in the state of Michigan, as well as across the country?
Brian, you want to go first, and then I'll give a Michigan specific answer?
Sure. I mean, I think so frankly, we don't, the numbers obviously are far fewer, and so it gets far less attention. I think, so Justice Policies does a fair amount of work in Maryland, and we actually do a lot of outreach and connect with particularly women who are in one of the women's facilities in the state. And there are a lot of women in there serving very long prison terms. And their experiences, sort of from everything from why they're in there. And I don't want to I hate to sort of oversimplify but you often sort of hear, you have sort of obviously women who've been subjected to verbal, emotional, physical, sexual abuse for their entire lives. A number of women are in there through frankly, just flat out self-defense after being victimized for a long period of time. And so that's one big piece of women who are in there, as well as women who are in there for other serious crime, but for very different reasons than men go in. And so how trauma is experienced as for a woman versus a man are very different. And I think one of the things that we've consistently heard, at least in the work that we've been doing in Maryland from women who are serving basically any prison term, but particularly long prison terms, is that there's really nothing specific to a woman's experience that's going on in incarcerated. So there's no, whether it's programming or interventions such as they are not necessarily designed for the experiences of what a lot of these women have lived through up to the point of their incarceration. So I think it's one of these situations where it is a small number relative to men, and so it gets far less attention. which I think is obviously a real problem that a lot of people have been raising, because it's not as simple as just saying, let's take these programs for men and we'll put in the women's prison. The causes and consequences of these experiences are very different for women and men, and we have not at all invested in the resources or the policies or practices that I think are sensitive to that fact.
Building off what Ryan said, in my prior life, I was a professor, and women in prison was kind of one of my areas that I taught on and was very passionate about. And what Ryan is saying is directly on point. Prisons were built for men, and all of the experiences, programmings were built around the assumption that it was going to be men in that space. So the needs of women are not met. And as Ryan pointed out, research suggests almost as much as 88% of women who are incarcerated have faced some form of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. So there are very high rates of trauma. There are also very high rates of trauma with our male prison population. But looking specifically at Michigan, our prison population is about 6% women. And for life sentences, it is a very similar proportion, but we have kind of nationally been seeing an increase in women in prison in the first place that has exploded while our prison population has exploded, as well as women serving very long sentences has also increased.
Just to add briefly to that, the state has one women's prison. It's in Washtenaw County, and I'm personally very concerned about the conditions in that prison. But without going into the conditions issues, I do want to say that one of the things I've identified at that prison, specific to some of the women who are staying there, is exactly in line with what Dr. Mahar and Mr. King were saying, which is that there are many women in that facility right now in Michigan who are still in prison 10, 20, 30 years after murdering their abuser. And the thing that really grinds my gears down is that I'm confident that if these women were to go in front of the court today, they probably wouldn't get a 20, 30 or life sentence. We've got women in there right now who are serving life without parole or long indeterminate sentences. They have really no light at the end of the tunnel for them. And when you look at their case, what they did was they murdered someone who was abusing them on a regular basis. And so once again, when you talk to these women, what they'll say, look, I probably should have gone to prison, but I've been here for 30 years. I'm 60 years old now. I think that it's time to let me out. And I agree. And that's why I'm asking the governor, and I'm calling upon all of you to join me in asking the governor to release these women. We could make a big dent in the overcrowding problem at Huron Valley. We could get a lot of people home who really shouldn't be there anymore anyway. And we should respect the fact that the way we administer justice in Michigan has changed a lot in the last few decades. And we shouldn't continue to punish people based on an outdated, poor understanding of accountability and justice.
Thank you all for responding to that. Another question that comes to mind that, again, I'll pose to all three of you in regards to the brain science that was used in to help with the passage of ending mandatory life sentences for juveniles. The brain science speaks also to those emerging adults between the ages of 18 and 25. The question that I pose to you is, can we, or how can we leverage the use of this brain science to end long and indeterminate sentences and perhaps life sentences altogether?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly. We're certainly going to use that research in talking about, why the legislature should pass a law that reforms our juvenile life without parole law. And that can only be helpful But one thing I would share with everybody out there who's an advocate and everybody out there who's willing to call their representative or their senator or their governor to ask for something, the data is great. The science is great. But if the people who are pressing the yes button and the no button were reading all the studies and reading all the science, we would be in a very different place right now. That's not what moves minds. What moves minds, as frustrating as it is for me personally to say, are emotional appeals. They need to hear the story. They need to see the person. They need to feel the person. They need to understand that person. And that is, I think, what's going to unlock the hearts of the people who currently aren't hip to these changes and why they're so necessary.
I'll pick up on that because I think I couldn't agree more. And I'm the person, that's my job, is working with data and numbers, but I also recognize the limitations. And so I think so I mentioned before, the District of Columbia just expanded an existing second look to include individuals up to the age of 25. Which is pretty amazing, and a lot of what we've been really doing is telling those stories of individuals, of some individuals who, not through the second look, but were paroled many decades later, who had gone in as emerging adults, and hearing their experiences and then seeing them now as adults. And these are individuals, many of whom I've been completely struck by by the number of people who've been served decades and decades in prison and come out. And the first thing they want to do is sign up. How do I get involved, and where can I work? Because partly I think if anybody is entitled to say, like, I don't want to think or talk about prison ever again for the rest of my life, it's people who've spent most of their adult life in prison. And so one of the things that I think we've seen a lot really successfully is telling the stories of those individuals, and seeing particularly how many of them have come out and really dedicated their life to try to either act as mentors with young people, or working on policy level, doing research, doing communications, other advocacy, is incredibly important, because it counters that conventional wisdom that these people are bad, they've done something bad, thus they are a bad person. So I couldn't agree more on that front. And I think also one of the things that we've seen, there's a unit in the Washington D.C. jail called the Young Men Emerging Unit, which is comprised of primarily young adults who are held in the DC jail, and the mentors there are mostly individuals who have gone in as either juveniles or emerging adults, and are actually being held in jail for hearings on second look. And it's been this amazing experience these past couple of years to see these individuals working with these young people, to try to mentor them, to try to help them, and to try to, the earlier question to me regarding how do we develop a different form of public safety, well, that's part of it, right? It's having these individuals from where these communities are of high rates of mass incarceration, going in and contributing and helping develop a different alternative approach. So telling those success stories and constantly being able to counter that narrative of sort of that, as Brian Stevenson says, you are more than the worst thing that you've ever done in your life. We have more and more stories, and we have to keep telling.
I totally agree. And, our moderator is a shining example of people who have, done time, understandably, might not have wanted to share their experience, but are out there sharing their story, actively trying to get other people involved, and helping the community. And Ryan, like you, I'm also a numbers person, so I will just add that if we were able to expand that data on brain science about those who are 25 and younger, and considering them not emerging adults, that would put a really big dent in the number of people who are serving very long sentences, because on average, those who are serving long sentences were generally younger when they committed the offense that results in that long sentence. So expanding that age to not just cut off people at, used to be 17, now 18, and then considering them adults would really put us in a better direction to reduce the number of people who are serving very long sentences.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Mahar, for the kind words, and thank you all for responding to that question. Another question that I would like to pose, and of course this is kind of going back to topics and issues that were already addressed, but would like to just flesh it out a little more. Dr. Mahar and Mr. King, you both stated that in the state of Michigan, as well as across the country, that the population of people who are serving 10+ years in prison has grown. Could you speak to what that means in regards to mass incarceration and in terms of the approach that we've been taking as a society towards reform?
You want me to start? So I will say, as we sort of walk through kind of the math of why it matters. So maybe I'll use this as an opportunity to sort of talk about how it changes the way we think about time in prison. And I think one of our biggest challenges is that people have a very kind of cavalier sense of time. And so you'll often hear, only before a sentence length of only 3 years, only 5 years, which, I think the only people who've never stepped foot in a prison would ever use the word only before a single night, let alone years and decades incarcerated. And so one of the things I do think, whether it's 10 years or longer, is it does sort of set the parameters of kind of, well, that's what we do here. And it has that feedback loop back into the community where people begin to just become kind of numb to these sentences that are 10, 15, 20 plus years that are really, relative to the way the rest of the world is, exceptional. People don't go to prison for as long as we do, as Americans do, particularly for the range of types of offenses that people do go to prison for. So in addition to the math pieces, I think it also has a real profound effect about how people think about long terms. And so if people are 10, 20, 30 years, then 2 or 3 years doesn't sound like much. But the impact on a person's life and the consequences of that are tremendous, as I'm sure many people watching are familiar with. So that's just a different angle that people may not have been thinking about, but I do think that it has that feedback loop coming back out into the community.
Thank you for that, Mr. King.
I was looking for the MDOC prison projection thing so I could kind of give an example of what Ryan was saying. So how we've focused on these non-serious offenses for our reforms and trying to reduce those sentences, reduce the number of people going into prison for those kinds of offenses, adds to that stacking that Ryan was referring to. So if we look at the MDOC and the average minimum sentence for those who are coming into prison, so commitments, the average sentence is, right, and I'm gonna say this jokingly, only 4 years. But if we look at the average sentence of those who are incarcerated in Michigan prisons, it is 11.5 years. So because we have focused so much on these short-term sentences, we are seeing our prison population, we're not seeing these substantial decreases that I think were the goal, because the people who are serving these long sentences are continuing to stack up and are serving these very long terms, while there's also the potential of focusing on these non-violent crimes. We need to make sure that we aren't kind of setting ourselves up for difficulty in the future, right? When we talk about non-violent crimes and are always making this comparison of, violent and non-violent offenders, there's a real danger of creating a more difficult wall for us to have to break down when we go and are actually able to tackle these bigger problems.
Thank you. Thank you for expounding on that, Dr. Mahar, and Mr. King. And now I would like to go to our questions from our audience. And again, these are questions, of course, that all of our panelists, please feel free to respond to. So the first question is, what effect does a parole board have on numbers in a state versus numbers in a state without a parole board? I would think that question will go to you, Mr. King.
Sure. So I think, so interestingly, there's been some research done in this that actually shows, I think this is where the question is going. There's been some research that shows that states that have parole boards actually have had a higher increase in rates of incarceration during the growth of the 90s and early 2000s relative to those without, which would potentially be surprising. That was, I think, a lot of people felt that truth in sentencing, for example, and as we've talked about, Michigan's truth in sentencing is of a whole different breed than most other jurisdictions. But the thought was truth in sentencing was driving prison populations. And I think the reality is, this is not a defense of truth in sentencing, but a lot of parole boards have been deeply dysfunctional, incredibly highly risk averse, often populated with political appointees that have law enforcement backgrounds. And so a really good reason why we haven't seen reductions in parole board states versus non-parole is that parole boards aren't really functioning the way that they were designed to, and the way that maybe they had in the 50s and 60s, where there was much greater use. And so I think there is still somewhat of a reckoning going on within the field of parole, where there has been an effort to really sort of professionalize and improve, standardize parole release decision-making, professionalize membership, diversify membership, try to use data and more information, but for release decision making. And the biggest piece, I think, and the problem has been in parole boards, is that there is an overwhelming reliance on the underlying circumstances of the crime for release decision making. And so we can't see time and time again in these states is that somebody can go in and they can spend 20 years in prison, and they can spend 20 years, following all the rules and dotting the I's and crossing all the T's. They can't go back in time and change what happened before they were sentenced, but they can change what happens in the future. But if the parole board's if they're not willing to get past that initial circumstances of the crime, there's nothing an individual can do. And that has been the single biggest issue. So unfortunately, parole boards, at least as often currently conceived and operating, are not necessarily a cure-all. But I do think there has been, in the last 10 years, a real growth of interest in, because there's no faster way to reduce your prison population than parole. You can do it very, very quickly. Sentencing takes time to work through. Parole, you can do it very quickly. And I think there has been an effort now to do a better job of, again, as I mentioned, trying to kind of standardize decision-making, trying to put the focus not on what happened. Remember, the sentencing judge is the one who made the decision based on the circumstances of the crime. The parole board's job should be everything that happened from the moment of sentencing until now. And I think we're trying to see some of that, but it's going to require, frankly, because, as I mentioned, political appointees often comprised of people from law enforcement backgrounds. It's going to require trying to bring a whole heck of a lot more objectivity and science and research to bear. And that is an ongoing challenge.
Thank you. Another question from our audience is, excluding the people that have been sentenced to life in prison, what's the data around the likelihood of dying in prison based on length of sentence?
So I can't speak too much about the data of the likelihood of death, but when talking about really long sentences, we have this idea of a virtual life sentence. So sentences that are so long that they are not technically a life sentence, but it is rather unlikely that the person serving it is going to outlive that sentence. So for example, if you have a minimum sentence of 60 years and you go in when you're 25, right, you're looking at 85 years old before you are even eligible for release. And right, due to the conditions of incarceration, healthcare inside, and those kinds of issues, we actually see our prison population is physically about 5 to 10 years older than their chronological age because of the conditions and the stress of incarceration. So while death is not necessarily more likely, the conditions inside do not support longevity.
Thank you for that, Dr. Mahar. Would anyone else like to chime in on that? If not, we do have another question. And this question is, are there any studies on how very long sentences may harm a person's ability to function well on the outside, especially if they went in as juveniles with no job skills or history and no technical or college training before becoming incarcerated?
So I can start. I don't know. I'm not familiar with studies on that topic, but I think practically we know for certain that the length of incarceration has a significant impact on your reentry experience and likelihood of transitioning out. And so one of the things that we've been doing work on both in Maryland and Washington, D.C. is trying to develop reentry programs, particularly so, as I mentioned, in Washington, D.C., we have the second look now. So we've got people coming out, many of whom have gone in as juveniles and are now coming out in their early to mid 40s. So they went in the mid 1990s as 15, 16 years old, coming from the streets of Washington, D.C. with very little education or any other kind of training or opportunity, then going right into the system and now coming out in their 40s. And one of the things that I think we've been fortunate to see in the district has been a real effort to target a different type of reentry resources toward that population, because going in if you've gone in as a young person and come out in your 40s and didn't have any of that training or opportunity or experience, that's very different than going in for like 2 or 3 years. And in Maryland, we also had a similar experience with individuals. There was a court case that resulted in about 200 folks coming out. It's called the Unger court case, after having served an average of about 40 years. The population was an average of 65 years old when they had come out. These are people who had gone in around late 1970s or early 80s. And so there ended up being a partnership with the University of Maryland School of Social Work to really develop specific types of reentry supports for people who were at that point in their 60s, who had been in for decades. And I think that is very similar, because there are just the health needs are different for folks who are, if you're coming out in 60s, 70s, and 80s, and if you're coming out like in your 40s and 50s, it's workforce training. It's also things like, learning how to, use a cell phone. I mean, one of the things that in Washington, D.C. was like learning how to use a Metro card in a bus. There's not cash anymore, right? Everything is a swipe card. And so a lot of that stuff, papers and documentation, that we constantly hear about, the challenges for reentering the community are pronounced and worse for people who've been in for decades, particularly if they've gone in at 15, 16 years old and never even had an opportunity to begin any semblance of an adult life.
Thank you. Thank you for expounding on that, Mr. King.
I'm not really, just to jump in here, I'm not really knowledgeable about the research, or as these researchers are, but one thing I can tell you that's been a need identified by myself and some other legislators that we're still working on is to improve the reentry services to make sure that people are connected with jobs and with housing, because we know that is going to be what they need to be successful, and it's going to save more money than it costs. But also another thing is to push some of these opportunities inside the walls of the prisons. And the thing that to me is just always so glaring is that if you've been in prison for any period of time, particularly a long period of time, the world has changed so dramatically with respect to computers and how computers are sort of the backbone to everything now. And it's been a continuing frustration of mine that we can't get more computer instruction classes brought into the prisons. The departments are so worried about giving prisoners any access to technology, or particularly to communications technology. And I mean, I think that some of their fears and concerns are justifiable, but I would rather have us address those concerns than what we're doing now, which is just to simply take these tools away from prisoners, which means that when they get out, they're just unfamiliar with the tools that are absolutely necessary to live.
Thank you for including that.
So just
That is
something
a valid point. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, Danny. Something that I wanted to add about the long sentences and people being released after very long sentences that I think isn't always brought up is the very, very low rates of recidivism for those who have served very long prison terms. And right, so that's right, at least partially due to aging out of crime. So, right, criminology has known for decades that at a certain point in your life, you are less likely to engage in crime. And in continuing to incarcerate people past that point, we are just getting lower returns for public safety. So they are not a risk to public safety anymore, and continuing to incarcerate them comes at very high cost to them, to the families of the incarcerated, as well as prison system costs, because as people are getting older, right, they are costing more to incarcerate because of those increased healthcare needs. So I think that I always want to bring in that part of, even after serving a very long time and being released into a world that is completely different than when they went inside, this population has very, very low rates of recidivism. The report that Ryan mentioned about the Unkers is a great example of people serving 40 years. And I think maybe 1 or 2 people return to prison. So very, very low rates of recidivism for this population.
Thank you. A very great point to include. And I am mindful of our time together, but we do have a couple of questions left. One being, so what are the panel's thoughts on the difference between trying to change truth in sentencing in Michigan via legislation compared to changing it using a ballot initiative?
You know, I think that the likelihood of there being a majority of Michigan legislators who are going to vote in favor of this is very low. And so, you know, I think that the passage of this kind of policy anytime in the near term would probably require going to the ballot. But of course, what I don't know is what does the polling say about that? You know, as was mentioned earlier by, I think, Dr. Mahar, there's a lot of education that needs to happen in this space. And when people hear the words truth in sentencing, we like truth. So why don't we like that? And the problem, you know, so that's an uphill battle, I suspect, but it's probably not as steep of an uphill as it is to convince the majority of the legislators.
So Safe and Just Michigan actually did some polling regarding these kinds of things last year, right before the pandemic hit, and hopefully we'll be releasing this, you know, information pretty soon. But we did find a lot of support for people if we were to propose reducing truth in sentencing, so not requiring the 100% minimum sentence, but like Senator Irwin said, there's a lot of education that needs to happen. So making sure that everyone understands what we mean by sentencing credits or reducing prison sentences, and that it's not a soft on crime kind of spin on it. It is, you know, a very thought through, well-researched and practiced idea. So I think that going through the legislator and a ballot initiative both make me nervous. But that's just who I am as a person.
Thank you. And one more question for, of course, again, all of our panelists. The question is for people who care about these issues. How can they support the work you're doing and the bills that will soon be introduced?
So, you know, I would first and foremost encourage everyone to reach out to their legislators, reach out to their elected officials, not just at the state legislative level, but also at the local level, your county commissioners, your city council people, your sheriff, your prosecutor, your judges. As was remarked on the chat, every one of these folks is an elected official. Every one of these folks is ultimately accountable to the voters. And as voters, you need to let them know what it is you want and let them know that you're going to be watching to see that they deliver on what it is you want. So first and foremost, build that relationship with your elected officials. Let them know what you think. Ask them to tell you what they think. And, then continue that conversation based on the answer. As was said earlier, a lot of times what's required is not just the data, but also the data plus a story and plus some urging from people who they work for. And so that can always be helpful. Encourage the governor to be supportive of these types of changes. Encourage the governor to use her powers of pardons and commutations. These are all, I think, important things that we need to do. And then finally, especially for those of you who are represented by a legislator who cares about these issues and believes in these issues, make sure you speak out to friends and family. Make sure you try to organize folks in other parts of the state that maybe aren't represented by people who support this and encourage them to do the same thing that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Mahar, Mr. King, anything?
So since I work for Safe and Just Michigan, all of the links that'll be on the closing slide are ways that you can help support Safe and Just Michigan. But if you want to support this work, I think a really important thing to do is to become familiar with the topics, right? So then you can share and have those conversations with your friends, family, loved ones, as well as your representatives. And small foreshadowing, we will have reports about the sentencing guidelines, truth in sentencing and such coming out in the near future.
Thank you. And Mr. King, anything you would like to add in regards to how people can support your work?
Yeah, no, I would reiterate, I think educate yourself on the issues, learn about them. There are tons and tons of resources out there. I mean, this is one benefit of this issue really getting such a higher profile. Is there are just a lot more folks doing really important work at the national and state level. So educate yourself and talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors. I mean, that's how this stuff happens, right? It's got to happen on that really granular, person-to-person relationship. I mean, we talked about what moves people. The messenger moves people a lot, right? And so there's elected folks, or there's a report writing, right? Or there's also your neighbor and your friend or a family member, right? And that can cut both ways. But I do think the more we can get people educating and learning and talking to folks, ideally from voices that they're more willing to listen to than others. I think the better off we'll be.
Thank you. Thank you all for your remarks. Are there any closing comments that our panelists would like to make in conclusion of today's panel discussion?
Well, I'll just thank Safe and Just Michigan and thank the other panelists and thank you, sir, for leading the panel. And just want to let everybody know that your legislators, your elected officials at the local level, we're the folks in the system that are directly accountable to you. So, please get involved. Please support organizations like Safe and Just and other organizations that are working in this space. Because we need change, and the only way we're going to get it is if we organize and we work together to make sure that the folks that are pressing the buttons understand what it is we need and want.
Thank you, Senator Jeff Irwin.
I'll just reiterate thank you, Safe and Just Michigan and fellow panelists, for having me on. Daniel, it was great to meet you. And again, just for folks, you all, as I said, this is really tremendously important work. And so I think Michigan is incredibly fortunate to have an organization like Safe and Just Michigan, and an elected official like Senator Irwin here who cares about this stuff. Not every place has that, either sort of enlightened, educated, passionate legislators or organizations like Safe and Just. And so really, really terrific work that you all are doing, and the rest of us and the rest of the country are watching, because ideally, rooting for your success and wanting to take those lessons learned and push those across the country.
I'll just echo them and saying thank you for including me in the conversation. It's been a great conversation, and also super excited about how many people were active in the chat. It's great to see everybody so engaged and energized about this issue.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to Senator Jeff Irwin, Mr. Ryan King, Dr. Mahar for joining me in today's panel. Thank you all who attended. In closing, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge those that have lost their lives while incarcerated due to COVID-19, and I offer this moment of silence. Thank you. Thank you all again. And back to you, Josh.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks to all of our co-sponsors, our panelists, and to our national co-sponsor, the Dream Corps Justice. And my screen just went down, so sorry about that. Be right with you. Sorry, tech problem. Safe and Just Michigan and the Dream Corps, thank you for participating in today's event. We'll be hosting more webinars down the line, so please keep an eye out throughout the spring and summer. On the screen, we've included several ways that you can keep in contact with Safe and Just Michigan, and we'll look forward to connecting with you soon. Thanks again for participating in today's panel. Have a great day.